Israel and Iran are now locked in a war that's probably the most worrying in recent times, more so with President Donald Trump's overt support, both on Truth Social and with his statements for Israel. Will it light up a Middle East that was already a tinderbox? What about Trump's within 2 weeks deadline? Will the US step in after that? And what are the long-term implications that the world has to fear? To talk about all this, we have Daniel Levy, peace negotiator under Israeli Prime Ministers Yitzhak Rabin and Ehud Barak, and now the president of the US Middle East Project. Welcome, Daniel.
Good to be with you, Rajesh.
Can we begin with your thoughts on the Israel-Iran war? It began with Israel launching an attack just days ahead of the sixth round of talks with the US. Iran was caught unawares.
Yes, I think one has to see this in the context of a few things, if I may. So firstly, that narrow angle of Israel, Iran. People may be aware that the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli system, but especially Prime Minister Netanyahu, have spoken about the Iranian threat for 3 decades. But, and this is quite important, there was no intelligence, credible information that Iran was rushing towards weaponizing its nuclear enrichment program. They have certainly advanced the levels of enrichment ever since Trump, at the request of Israel in his first term, chose to pull out and therefore nullify the nuclear agreement that had been reached between the so-called P5+1 and Iran. So Israel is making the claim that this had to happen now for reasons of Iran tipping into an urgent attempt to weaponize it. That doesn't seem credible. You could argue that operationally, with the successful degradation of Hezbollah by Israel, with Assad being removed, not by Israel, but internally, and with Iran's air defenses being weakened, this was operationally an opportunity. But I think one has to look at least 3 other vectors, and I'll just list them very briefly. Number one, the Israelis were probably worried, and Netanyahu specifically, that if the US-Iran talks advanced, then the US would give a clear no in terms of Israel's desire to strike at the Iranian facilities and to strike at Iran more generally. So the timing, I think, was designed to undermine those talks. Perhaps Trump believed it would help the talks, but I don't think that's how most people see it playing out. Secondly, you always have to look a little bit at the domestic politics inside Israel. Netanyahu is in a coalition crisis. He has held his government together, which is a remarkable success, but one is entering election season and he needs something to reshuffle the deck. He's losing in every opinion poll. So this was probably his last big roll of the dice. And thirdly, this, of course, happens against the backdrop of what has been going on with Israel's assault on the Palestinians. And in particular, you were beginning to see perhaps a tipping point in terms of how the images out of Gaza, the intentional starvation program, another level of cruelty with the shooting of people in this deeply problematic foundation and distribution sites that had been set up. Israel's war crimes in Gaza were beginning to move even Israel's Western allies to question some of that relationship. And this has been a fabulous distraction. So if you package that together, I think you can understand the backdrop.
2 of the points that I had been thinking of were about the existential threat that Benjamin Netanyahu is facing because of it being election season. And the other one was about the US intelligence report that said that Iran was at least 3 years away from developing a nuclear bomb. Does this not question the very rationale of the war? Both those reasons.
Well, I think most people on the outside are exactly where you just suggested, Rajesh, which is they do question the rationale of the war. And therefore, I think it feels rather transparent that the Israeli claim as to why they are doing this doesn't stack up with the evidence and the composite picture one can establish of what's going on. Therefore, one has to look elsewhere for an explanation. And let's just remember, Israel is a nuclear armed state. Israel has nuclear weapons. And what many people are saying is, does this tip the balance in terms of Iran making a decision which it hadn't made? Namely, that perhaps it needs that deterrence. I don't need to tell you where you sit in your part of the world, that things look quite different if two states both have this ultimate resort to a certain type of deterrence, as opposed to the asymmetry in the Middle East region, where only Israel has nuclear weapons. And so I think a lot of the states in the region, who aren't necessarily very close to Iran, but have been trying to work in a pragmatic fashion with Iran. You had the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, you had an awful lot of contacts there. Israel likes to claim that it's Israel and the moderates in the region against Iran, but I think how most of the rest of the region now looks at it, especially against the backdrop of such a radicalizing, destabilizing impact of what Israel is doing against the Palestinians, doing in Gaza, also in many respects in the occupied West Bank, they look at this and they say, Israel is again tipping the balance towards chaos, because those Gulf states and others are genuinely concerned at what the fallout from this can be, because if Iran's back is enough against the wall, then others might be brought in. And so people aren't really buying the Israeli explanation. But what Netanyahu has tried to do is to focus really in one space, in that tiny bit of real estate between the ears of the American president. And he has tried to create an equation where he brings the US into this war to directly engage, because they can do things that the Israelis can't, because then it becomes America's problem. So I think that's also an important prism through which to understand this. Can they bring the Americans in? And by doing what they've done, I think the Israelis are now trying to communicate the message. Now we've gone this far, it's more dangerous not to finish the job than to go in and America to bomb these facilities, because the Iranians may now decide they have to change their strategic posture. They're trying to create a fait accompli. It looked like Trump was going that way. Now there is apparently a pause in the American decision-making structure.
Let's talk about the situation on the ground. Is it as simple as a very strong Israel versus a significantly weakened Iran?
Really interesting question. I don't think it's that simple. And one of the reasons it's not that simple is I think one has to factor in the pain threshold of the respective parties, okay? So let's look at the nature of the Iranian economy, for instance. Very used to running a resistance economy living under sanctions. Israel, the opposite, very plugged in. So what it does to Israel's economy when you can't go in and out of the country, the airspace inside Israel is largely or almost entirely closed to commercial vehicles, where Israel is brought to an economic standstill. And then there's the more simple pain threshold. Israelis have never seen these kinds of strikes deep inside their own cities and towns before. And although what they are able to inflict on Iran, I think this is the case, that what they are able to inflict on Iran is more dramatic, more devastating. Iran doesn't have to meet them one for one. And so Iranian missiles into Israel have less of a precision targeting, but many Israeli military analysts have acknowledged that they are targeting military targets, and some of those have been hit, including air bases. Israel, of course, with apparent near domination of the skies over Iran, is able to be more precise. But Israelis are also looking at a couple of other things. They do not have an endless supply of interceptor missiles, okay? So they have these interceptors, but these don't get knocked out of the factory hundreds a day. So that supply is, I think, a limiting factor. And then you are also operating 2,000 kilometers from your border in the skies. That comes quite draining on your pilots, etc. So there are factors here that could mean that Israel doesn't have the capacity to continue this indefinitely. I think it's important to get a sense of scale. Israel is a small country, okay? Its population of approximately 10 million, less even, means that those who it can draw from to have in the ranks of its military, especially when two large population groups, the ultra-Orthodox and the Palestinians, don't serve, people are exhausted from the amount of reserve duty they've been doing. So if we factor all of this in, then what looks like an equation where even a country with a smaller population than Iran's population over 90 million, is able to do this damage, it's not a cakewalk, to use that phrase.
I'm hearing that Iran is capable of producing missiles at a pretty good clip when compared to Israel. Is that true?
Well, I'm reading the same information as you, Rajesh, and I think it's sufficiently sourced that it sounds quite credible. So Israel is now focusing on the missile launching facilities spread across Iran. It hasn't managed to take those out thus far. I think we cannot know for sure exactly how depleted Israel's interceptor missiles are. We cannot know for sure exactly how many missiles Iran has left, how able it is to replenish those stocks. But it does seem like Iran is able to continue to inflict a not insignificant degree of pain. And then let's just acknowledge that there are things that Iran has not brought into the equation yet, which the best estimates, to my knowledge, suggest that they could bring in. They've just chosen not to. So number one, they've chosen not to expand the circle of the conflict. It's been directly targeting Israel. Put their backs up against the wall, and then what do we see in the Straits of Hormuz? What do we see sent into Gulf states that I don't think they want to go there? And the other factor that hasn't come into play is that the Houthis and the militias in Iraq have been very quiet. Now, I think it's harder for Hezbollah to now join this, but those two factors are perhaps being kept in abeyance to wait and see where this goes, and also to signal to the US that we still have other assets that we could bring in to play that could threaten you directly, but we're not doing that because you haven't yet made your designation as to whether you will join this directly.
That is what is happening in Gaza for over 600 days, and that is Iran now. What are your thoughts about the way the world has reacted to all this?
I think in a fashion which we all regretfully may come to look back on this and say, were new norms established which will hold all of us? And we may also come back to look at this and say, we know the international multilateral system, the international legal architecture for holding states to account when they are committing war crimes, we know it's imperfect. But was it a good idea to smash it up so transparently by not stepping up when relentless war crimes were being committed against the Palestinians in Gaza? And I think we may live to regret that, because it may well set new standards, and it may be harder to hold others to any kind of standard in the wake of this. So what Israel was doing to the Palestinians for decades in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the unwillingness to end an occupation that has now been declared by the International Court of Justice as illegal in its very nature, the relentless closures, denial of human rights and dignities, all of those things which you now have very strong evidence backed up by the International Court of Justice that this is an apartheid system. All of those things were left to fester. Then Hamas responded by carrying out its own violations of international law. And Israel's response was to double down on that and to pursue a policy which doesn't make sense if you're looking at this from a security lens. It doesn't make sense if you're looking at this through the lens of trying to weaken an armed group that poses a threat. It doesn't make sense if you're thinking, how do we get the Israelis who are being held in Gaza released? It only makes sense if you factor in much broader, problematic, and let's just use the honest words, extreme messianic goals, which seem to be making the Palestinian territories unlivable for Palestinians. And they openly declare this, the intention to ethnically cleanse. And that's why, with significant credibility and in the international court, this is now being judged as a genocide. But the world stood by. And let's narrow that down a little. Israel's Western allies stood by and allowed this to happen, continue to arm Israel, continue to provide diplomatic cover, of course, with the US in the lead. But it wasn't just the US. And I think as much of the rest of the world and the global majority, global South, looked at this, and they looked at it especially in the context of having just been lectured by the West over, where are you on Russia, Ukraine? We thought you were with us in upholding values, and then it all collapsed because they totally failed to uphold those laws, that system, those values in Gaza. So I think we have set ourselves on a very dangerous path.
The most vital question now is if Donald Trump will join the war. There's already been a significant level of support from the US for Israel, going by the reports that we are seeing. But now that Trump has come out with his within 2 weeks statement, do you sense a keenness to do a deal?
This is really the question that everyone is toiling with. And it's so difficult because we know that this is a president very capable of flipping on a dime. We know that 2 weeks may not also be 2 weeks. It may be that the 2 weeks is also part of a head fake. What is interesting to look at is, and I'm sure people are aware of this, there does seem to be a serious contestation within Trump world, within that MAGA, Make America Great Again community. And there is serious pushback here. You have some of the most significant figures who helped get Trump elected saying, wait a minute, you said you were the peace guy, not the war guy. You said you would put American interests first. How is this an American interest? Israel started this war. Israel is trying to drag America into this war. We have no existential challenge here. Our Gulf allies don't want us to do this. This isn't going to be good for our economy if oil fields burn, if others are brought into this. What American interest? And we've been here before. This isn't our first rodeo. America got dragged into the Iraq war by domestic neoconservatives lying and by Israel pushing. Are you going to be another American president led by the nose by an Israeli prime minister? That's not who we thought you were. On the other hand, you have those who are saying, Mr. President, everyone's now calling you the taco president. Trump always chickens out. You've got to prove that that's not the case. This could reset the deck in terms of you showing that you can use force, but you're ready to make deals that can help you in other circumstances. And Israel will be making the case, we've teed this up for you. You know, the guy likes golf. Israel would say, we've taken the ball right up to the hole. All you have to do is a gentle little putt, blow up 4-0, and don't worry, what could possibly go wrong? And I think the question is going to be, do those who make the what could possibly go wrong argument win? Or do those who say, well, I'll list for you what could go wrong, and it's an awfully long and quite compelling list. So that's the dynamic, but we have to also be acutely aware. Number one, that if you wait for 2 weeks, you can be a hostage of events, of circumstances, of developments. Does Iran get provoked to an extent that it does something that the Americans feel they have to come in? Do the Israelis conduct some kind of provocation with a view to pulling the Americans in? That's one thing. And secondly, the rest of the world is looking at this and looking, what kind of a president are you going to be? Are you going to be a serious negotiator, or are you going to basically torpedo your own negotiations? Are you going to use negotiations as a cover for strikes? And are you going to send the signal to everyone, really, that if you have the ability to militarily move first, you may benefit from that. Although ultimately, I don't think the benefit will play out, because I do think that if this is pushed further, the consequences are going to be significant, and they may be ones that we haven't anticipated.
All signs are, though, that for a peace deal, there will be need for the Iranians to do all the yielding. How likely is that?
Well, I think here's the distinction, Rajesh, between a peace deal and a diktat that amounts to a capitulation. I don't see that happening. I think those who do not want to see a successful negotiation and who do want to bring Trump into this militarily are trying to set up the equation that says, of course you can still negotiate. If Iran comes and says, we'll give up everything, we'll give up our not only our rights under the NPT, under the Non-Proliferation Treaty for civilian nuclear enrichment, but we'll also give up all our missile program. Basically, you guys take over. It's almost the same as regime change. So I don't think that that is a negotiating format that can deliver a result, which is precisely why some are saying that's the only negotiated outcome you should accept, Mr. President. In other words, there is a zone of potential agreement. It's not the one that American negotiators have been willing to contemplate thus far, but it could change. I mean, you clearly again have these competing factions. And according to what we've read and what we're led to believe, Witkoff was in a negotiation with the Iranians where there were possibly mutually acceptable solutions on the enrichment issue. And this line that Iran must never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon is a line that Iran is willing to sign up to. It has been willing to sign up to throughout. Apparently, they tried to pull Witkoff to a different place, not what was agreed. And now we're going to have to see, whether they take a maximalist line or whether there is wiggle room for an agreement. Let's also just step back and acknowledge that Witkoff is 0 for 3. They went in doing Russia, Ukraine, Iran, and the Gaza ceasefire. And in all three places, conflict is now more intense than when Witkoff started.
As a seasoned negotiator yourself at the very highest levels, if you were in charge of this negotiation, how would you have gone about it?
I think there's a quite simple rule of negotiation. Of course, the details always matter. Everything has its granularity. But that simple rule is, of course you can use pressure. Of course you try to influence the negotiating margins of the other side. But in a negotiation, you have to create a situation where both parties can have a narrative that works in their political setting, that they can turn to their own people and say, look, the other side are going to be saying X, but here's why for our side, this is a not only dignified, but a good outcome. And yet there isn't, I don't think, a way that you can negotiate if you don't hold that in your mind. I'd also, though, say the details do matter, and there is a genuine question and concern here. Are the Americans up to speed on the details of the files that this team is dealing with? Look, we've all had experience with a US that comes in with preconceived notions, that gets things wrong. There's what others have referred to as the DC blob, where there's kind of groupthink in Washington, DC. But here, I think you have a more distinct problem, which is, have they disposed with so much of the expertise that you have people insufficiently familiar with the files That can be a good thing if they don't carry all the baggage, some of which was unhelpful from the past, but it can be a bad thing if they don't enough know what the hell they're supposed to be negotiating.
Going by what you say, is this negotiation already doomed to fail? It's a real estate tycoon leading it, and they seem to have a very hard stance that they brought to the table.
I don't want to say that, not only because I want to have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, but because it depends what intentionality you go in with. If you are convinced that the other options are worse than the option of looking again at the substance of the negotiation, looking at where you can tweak your position in order to give that narrative of this is good for us to the other side. If they are convinced that the other options are worse for them, then I still think they can get to a negotiating position that could see this de-escalate rather than the opposite. It's not the trajectory we are on. It's not the path we seem to be on. We seem to be on a path where either America will be pulled in, and then this really becomes, in a more direct way, America's war. In some respects, both Gaza and Iran already have an element in which they're America's war. So we either seem to be on the path to that, or on the path to, at some stage, Israel deciding without America, there's not much more it can do. It's done an awful lot. It's beginning to suffer exhaustion on its home front, and then declaring unilaterally this is over, daring the Iranians to violate that. But having already perhaps caused enough chaos and anger that even if there is short-term quiet, we may well have the reverberations and the repercussions and the dangers that flow from this for quite some time to come. But the negotiating door is still open. It's difficult right now.
Finally, this war is playing out in the Middle East, and there are many religious fault lines to consider. Many of the humanitarian red lines have also been crossed. What do you see as a long-term impact, and how worried should we be?
I think the news here is not good. I think already some of the lines that have been crossed. I mean, look, we saw what happened with a hospital in the southern Israeli city of Beersheba, the Sirocco hospital. But it was really difficult for many people not to look at that and say, you just destroyed every hospital in Gaza. What were you thinking when you did that if you weren't expecting there was blowback? And I don't think the Iranians intentionally, unlike the Israelis in Gaza, intentionally targeted that. That's what many Israeli military analysts have suggested, that there were targets nearby. So what I'm saying is that there are lines that have been crossed, which we may well all regret. The long-term effect of this, I fear, in the region itself, is that more and more of the publics, but also in their own ways, more of the leaderships are going to be convinced that Israel is acting like a radicalizing, destabilizing, revisionist state, which is a problem. Because it is, when your population is watching these images every day, it winds that population up. It becomes a security issue for you. And so I think people would really like to see Israel step back from this, be encouraged to step back from this, also for its own good, for its own well-being, by its friends. It has friends in the West, it has friends elsewhere. That Israel needs to step back from this, because otherwise we are in a very significant downward spiral that won't just end in the Middle East. As you say, there are co-religionists of those who've been impacted elsewhere. And the last thing we need is for Israel to act as the theocratic genocidal state with a nuclear weapon, which it accuses Iran of being. So you don't have many voices of moderation and realism and caution at the moment inside Israel. You have got one of the opposition figures, Yair Golan, who has turned around and said, whatever the military achieves in Gaza or in Iran, unless you have a political plan for the day after, we are stuck, and this will only take us to bad places. And I think that's what's missing with the current Israeli leadership, with their lack of pragmatism, with their extremism, is that you can't be a regional hegemon if your only tool for solving problems is bombs, and if your vision for the region is one that is fundamentally unacceptable to those who you live around because it's unreasonable. So there's the fault line. Israel needs to be pulled back from that for the good of those around it, but also for its own good. And we're not there at the moment. And if I very briefly cast a slightly wider net, this may well be accelerating an already shifting geopolitics globally, and an already shifting set of where power and also soft power resides. Because people are now looking and saying, well, who are the responsible multilateral powers who aren't willing to lend a hand to an extreme ally like that? And that's one of the knock-on effects, because I think much of the world has lost its patience with a state that's acting in a rogue fashion and has the backing of the US. And like I say, I say all of this with no joy and with a great deal of pain, because I think this is very dangerous also for Israel itself.
Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate you sharing both your time and your insights. Take care and have a great day.
Thank you, Rajesh. Pleasure to be with you.